Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
This university will no longer continue any funding of any kind for your group's activities.
Jesus Christ is the object of all things, the center towards which all things tend. Whoever knows him knows the reason for everything. Blaise Pascal. Well, welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, and I'm here with Chad Gross. He's back. How you doing this week, Chad?
Well, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad that no family members had any tumbles that I had to help them through. And so I'm able to podcast today, and everyone's healthy, and Mom is recovering. So I'm glad about that.
Great. Well, I won't ask any further questions. You can disclose whatever you want.
Well, you know, my mom is very active. She's very young for her age, if you will. She was working and she had a stumble, and unfortunately it was just kind of one of those freak things where the rubber on her shoe kind of grabbed the concrete. And when she was walking, and she just went down. The
pole vault bar, it was just raised 3 inches higher than normal, and
that's what happened.
Didn't clear it.
Yes, and you know, I told her, Mom, I'm like, at your age, you can't raise it that high. And she was like, forget you, man. So anyway, I mean, literally, gosh, it was like I was supposed to be on with you at like 4:30, and the secretary at school comes into my room. Students have already left. It's like 3:20. And she says, the nurse from, you know, where my mom was, she's on the phone. She wants to talk to you. She said, she has your mom, but it's not an emergency. And I'm thinking, oh, yeah, because nurses always call when it's not an emergency. So I get on the phone and they tell me what happened. And of course, I'm like, they don't want her to drive because she hit her head. And that could lead to dizziness and passing out. And apparently there was a good bit of blood and things like that. So I, of course, had to text you and be like, I can't do the podcast. So thankfully you were able to. That's one of the advantages of having two, except we never want me to do one by myself. But anyway, one of the advantages is that you could go ahead and do it with the Kunkles, and I'm looking forward to hearing that.
Yeah.
So here I be, and Mom is well. They glued her head up, and she's good to go. They did. And you know what's funny?
I know what happened. You were like, Mom, I'm on my way. I've got the Mod Podge from the craft room. I'm on my way. Like
actually,
paper mache.
I actually stopped by the Dollar Tree and got crazy glue. I mean, I didn't want it. Mod Podge is pretty expensive, you know. No. But what was really like interesting? So what was really interesting is when we were in the urgent care, the doctor is in there. And of course, my mom's like, you know, the doctor says, well, you could do either stitches or glue. And my mom said, well, whatever you think would best, you know, seal the cut or help the cut heal is what I want you to go with. And the doctor says, it's up to you. And my mom looks at me like, what? I don't know anything about this. Like, what am I supposed to flip a coin? So she asked the doctor a few questions, and then finally the doctor said, well, there's probably less chance of scarring if we go with glue. And I thought to myself, well, you could have led with that. It saved us about 5 minutes.
Could you give us some time here? Could you give us a few minutes? We're going to go Google this because you won't tell us.
I know. It was so odd. So anywho, Mom's all glued up and healed up. She's a little bruised, but she's no worse for the wear, thankfully.
Oh, man. Well, listeners, I want to point you to last week's episode, if you're a parent especially. Great conversation with Brett and Aaron Kunkel from Maven. They have a podcast called the Maven Parent Podcast, and you can glean a lot of great stuff from that. The main thrust of the interview was talking about how we can use sort of a discipleship model for parenting and come at it from a worldview perspective. So I got a lot out of it. I'm looking forward to listening to it again. Always get more on the second listen after the edit, and so very much appreciate them. Check it out. That is podcast number 068. Go there now. Okay, you're back from that, so let's continue.
Hey, so I wanted to share with you, I listened to a podcast with our friend, J. Warner Wallace, this week. That was really interesting. The title of it was Observations about the Ravi Zacharias Scandal 1 year later. And what I took from it that was really interesting is, you know, that paradigm that he shares in Cold Case Christianity, where he says that the reasons people are going to commit a crime are either for power, sex, or money.
Yes.
And he argues back to that fundamentally it's power. But one of the things he shared in there that echoes some of the conversations we've had on the podcast that I thought were worth pointing out is he points out this idea of how what would a lot of people do who have social media platforms. And if somebody said, okay, we're no longer going to share your likes, we're no longer going to share your numbers, we're only doing this. You have no idea how many people are watching your videos. You have no idea how many people, how popular this is or how unpopular this is. And he says, how many people would actually continue doing it? And I thought it was really, really challenging. And he had a lot of good things to say about not making your ministry. And these just echo, like I said, things we've talked about, not making your ministry about you, but about the knowledge that you're sharing and about the gospel. And he talked about how that's why Cold Case Christianity is called that, because he won't call it J. Warner Wallace Ministries or anything like that. And then also they took all his thumbnails off his YouTube videos shortly after the Ravi thing, because they want to make sure that they're kind of erring on the side of caution when it comes to making the ministry about him. But it was just really refreshing to listen to things that kind of reinforced a lot of the things we've talked about how this is not about your brand. This is not about you. This is not about your likes. It's about, you know, setting forth the truth and offering good content to people who are looking for it. And so I just thought that was really interesting and encouraging at the same time. I also hadn't realized that in this, I don't want to get into this topic just because there's so much been said about it. And you and I have talked about it a good bit just privately. But I didn't realize it was the first time he had spoken out about the Ravi situation at all. He said that he didn't want to jump into that right away when it was, I guess, you know, when the news just broke and things like that. The podcast really ended up being more about kind of a cautionary tale of how can we keep this from happening to us, whether you're a public Christian or whether you're just an everyday layman who's just, how can you keep yourself from falling into these desires and falling into the temptation to seek power or money or sex. And so it was really helpful. Yeah.
I listened to it as well. And he equates power in this. He kind of equates power and fame the same way, you know, fame/power.
Yeah, yes.
And in that sense, he would have said that Ravi was obviously he was famous. And from that fame comes money. From the money comes the other things. And real unfortunate, but good insights from J. Warner Wallace. And so I'd recommend having a listen if you're interested in that or those reflections. And also just why are we doing what we're doing? Is it for building our own brand, trying to get glory? Oh, look at how many views we've got or downloads or whatever. Sad, but it's human nature, and so you have to plan for that. And I'm just saying human nature because I'm trying to transition now to Pascal, who does talk a lot about human nature. So I opened the podcast with a quote from Pascal, where he says, Jesus Christ is the object of all things, the center towards which all things tend. Whoever knows him knows the reason for everything. I've been reading through Pascal again and love it, the Pensées, or the thoughts of Pascal.
I just wanted to share this. Was super cool. So I was at work on Friday afternoon and I had everything done. Well, everything I was willing to do with 10 minutes left. And I found Pensées was on Amazon. You know, you could download it on Kindle for free. It's on there for free. So I downloaded it and, started reading it. And then shortly after that, I get an email from you saying, hey, I think we're going to talk about Pascal. So that was just kind of cool that it worked out that way.
Yeah, I was thinking, and I prayed, Lord, what should we talk about? And I just waited and thought, and I want to talk about that. And so we're going to talk a bit about Blaise Pascal's book and his thoughts. So I think you should read Pascal. So my goal in this conversation is to show you some of the cool things he wrote so as to convince you that it's worth reading. And in so doing, I hope to do 3 things. So this is me speaking to you, Chad. I was going to say, I want to convince you to read Pascal, thus enriching your life in various ways, but you've already started, so you preemptively, I've succeeded already. Woo! So in this case, keep reading. The second is to convince our listeners to do the same thing. Like, hey, I think this is going to enrich you if you're willing to sit and think and mull over the different strands of thought that have been collected from his writings. Basically, in this podcast, just to reflect on some of the things he's written and how they apply to us in our present day. And I mentioned in the previous podcast when I was listening to Peter Kreft's book on Pascal called Christianity for Modern Pagans, he basically entitles his book that way because Pascal was writing for his generation who was apathetic and distracted and didn't want to have anything to do with God. And Pascal was trying to break through that apathy and crack through that hardcore and say, listen, you need to seek after God. God, yes, he seems hidden. You need to seek after him. But he has an approach to try to break through this hard shell of skepticism and apathy and distraction in order to do that. Well, we'll talk a little bit about the book here in a minute, but let me just say that I'm not an authority on Pascal. I'm only an authority in the same way that someone who's watched Star Wars more than you have might be an authority for Star Wars. So I wrote a review about the book, so I'll read the review. Not too long, just a few paragraphs, but trying to find a short way to encapsulate the overall idea. And keep in mind, because I'm not an expert, I'm going to leave stuff out. So in the span of a short life of 39 years, from 1623 to 1662, the French-born Blaise Pascal made his mark as scientist, inventor, philosopher, and theologian. Yet his Pensées, maybe some people say Pensées, thoughts, published 8 years after his death, continues to make an impact because of its depth and insight. It's really just a compilation of Pascal's notes, which he intended to be made into a defense of Christianity or an apologetic. However, because of Pascal's poor health, he died before he was able to complete the work. So the Pensées we have today are arranged thematically. These themes range from the wretchedness and greatness of man to the use of reason and the proofs for God. Often Pascal's making observations on human nature, always returning to the theme of the lowly state of man, the paradox of man's greatness and man's depravity. At times he paints a dramatic picture of the state of man. He used a lot of different illustrations, but here's one that I liked. Imagine a number of men in chains, all under sentence of death, some of whom are each day butchered in the sight of the others. Those remaining see their own condition and that of their fellows, and looking at each other with grief and despair, await their turn. This is an image of the human condition. So Pascal points to the fact that everybody is going to die, and he wants to remind them of that fact, and he says, we run heedlessly into the abyss after putting something in front of us to stop us from seeing it. Hence my remark the other day on the Doug Grotice interview, where this is just a screen now that we've put in front of our face. You know, we're going towards death, but we're not ever thinking about it because we got phone in front of our face. Well, in Pascal's day, they're doing something else, and he refers to different things in his writing about like hunting or fishing or distractions and entertainment. Well, nothing's changed. People not thinking about death. They don't want to think about death.
We just might have more ways to distract ourselves from it.
Oh, yeah.
But we're still working hard to distract ourselves from it.
Yeah, it's like the age of mega distraction. Pascal emphasizes the fallen state of mankind, the need to seek after God, and the centrality of Christ. Many times he points to the hiddenness of God, and he says, there is enough light for those who desire only to see, and enough darkness for those of a contrary disposition. It's kind of saying that, hey, you know, if you want to find God, you can. There's enough light for that. If you want to reject him, there's enough darkness for that. So in Pascal's view, I would say that he's saying that the evidence is ambiguous. It's not coercive, if you want to use that word. While he points out that it is the disposition of one's will that plays a large role in one's seeing God, he also emphasizes the need for God himself to open the eyes. So Pascal's view is not one of like, oh, well, we can use these proofs and reason towards God. No, he rejects that, and he says that, you know, these things might be a means by which God does this, but faith comes from God. He's very upfront about that. It's like, you know, God has to show himself to you.
Right.
The reader will enjoy the full context of Pascal's wager. We're not going to talk about that today. It's bigger, and maybe we'll save it for another one. The core of which I think could be summarized thusly. I should be much more afraid of being mistaken and then finding out that Christianity is true than of being mistaken in believing it to be true. Some of these things are better read than heard. So go back and rehear that again. The wager address itself spans about 5 pages and is not merely a paragraph admonishing the believer that he has nothing to lose. Many have gone so far as to think mistakenly that the wager was intended to be an argument for the existence of God. Instead, Pascal's wager is but a key part of a larger line of reasoning intended to persuade the unbeliever to seek after God. He's basically saying, hey, there is a real personal motivation that there's a vested interest you have in seeking God because the stakes are so high. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later. Grieved by the indifference of man, we can hear Pascal's heart. Nothing is so important to man as his state, nothing more fearful than eternity. Thus, the fact that there exist men who are indifferent to the loss of their being and the peril of an eternity of wretchedness is against nature. He returns once again to the need to seek after God. There are only 2 classes of persons who can be called reasonable: those who serve God with all their heart because they know him, and those who seek him with all their heart because they do not know him. In addition to providing deep, probing insights into the nature of man and his need to seek God, Pascal also presents a case for the truth of Christianity through Scripture, fulfilled prophecy, and the person of Jesus Christ. So if you're thinking this is like just, it's a philosophy book, I'm not into philosophy. No, it's really like a book of introspection, ideas about reflecting and introspecting and thinking about your final state and talking about reason and its limits and our humility and the need to seek that God has hidden himself, and that you need to seek after that hidden God. And then he does give an apologetic of evidences such as fulfilled prophecy and Scripture and focusing a lot on Jesus Christ. So he's not just like philosophical arguments rolling off. It's a real appeal to the heart, but super thoughtful. So filled with profound thought and perspective, Pascal's Pensées is a treasure of a book that is sure to challenge and enrich.
That's a very good overview, and it kind of whets the appetite for sure.
Remember, I was telling you about how, back to Peter Kreeft, when he was talking about Thomas Aquinas, and he's written millions of words, and then he has an experience with God, and then he's like, well, that was straw. I've experienced God. And if anyone thinks that Pascal is, just a thinker only, there was this thing that can be called like Pascal's Night of Fire, which I think is really cool. It shows you where he's at with his focus on Jesus. There's a little excerpt here about this experience Pascal had in November 23rd, 1654. He met his seeker in a dramatic encounter, and with him found wholeness. There's this night of revelation that he had, which was discovered by an accident. So Pascal dies, and a servant is going through his stuff after his death, and he's feeling around in the lining of this coat, and he feels a lump. And so he's like trying to figure out what's been sewn in there. And on it, he found this parchment that had been written on, and also copied on a piece of worn but carefully preserved paper, the record of, in Pascal's own handwriting, this event that happened in his life, which we can argue is this crucial central event of his life. It is apparent that he had been reading the Scriptures, probably the passage describing God's appearance to Moses in the burning bush, and it was through this Scripture that he too met God. So on there's this like log of where it says from 10:30 till the evening until about 12:30. So like for 2 hours, he's having this intense experience, like a personal meeting with God. And so it wasn't anymore just a theological idea to him or an intuition or a seeking, but it was an experience. So it's referred to as Pascal's Night of Fire. And I think it's so cool because he has this experience for 2 hours with God. He writes it down, flow of consciousness sort of way, after he has this experience just to capture it. And then he keeps it with him all the time, sewn into the seam of his coat. And I've heard some people say that he would have taken it, and if he got a new coat, he would have put it into the next coat, always with him. I don't know if that's true or not, but I find that very interesting. So here's what it reads. Memorial in the year of grace 1654, Monday the 23rd of November, from about 10:30 in the evening until about 12:30. Fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and scholars. Certitude, feeling, joy, peace, God of Jesus Christ. My God and your God, John 20:17. Your God will be my God. Forgetfulness of the world and of everything except God. He is to be found only by the ways taught in the gospel. Greatness of the human soul. Righteous Father, the world has not known thee, but I have known thee. Joy, 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 tears of joy. I've separated myself from him. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. My God, wilt thou leave me? Let me not be separated from him eternally. This is eternal life, that they might know thee, the only true God, and the one whom thou hast sent, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. I have separated myself from him. I have fled from him, denied him, crucified him. Let me never be separated from him. We keep hold of him only by the ways taught in the gospel. Renunciation, total and sweet. Submission, total and sweet. Total submission to Jesus Christ and to my director. Eternally in joy for a day's training on earth. I will not forget thy words. Psalm 118:16. Amen. So, yeah, it's not like he sat down to write something that was for other people to read. This is flow of consciousness. I'm capturing what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing right now, and then he just holds it close to his heart, so to speak, until his death. And only, he's not sharing that experience with people. They only discovered after the fact, and I think that's really amazing. That's why I opened with that quote where it says, Jesus Christ is the object of all things, the center towards which all things tend. Whoever knows him knows the reason for everything. I thought that was amazing. I just wanted to share that because I thought it, even in our apologetics, that we want to keep Jesus the center,
What he says there too about Jesus kind of brings to mind or echoes what Paul writes in Colossians, where he says, I want their hearts to be encouraged and joined together in love, so that they may have all the riches of complete understanding and have the knowledge of God's mystery, Christ. In him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge.
Yeah. So that was just a bit about Pascal, a little bit about his experience. Here, I want to share a quote from him about his apologetic methodology, because in the Pensées, basically, this is not his finished work. This was all the different thoughts that he had been writing down on different fragments of papers, all of which he's kind of like put little headers on. Oh, this goes in this section here, this goes in this section here. And then only after the fact has it been pieced together thematically and numbered. So throughout your edition of Pascal, there are two different editions. I have the original one. And then, so you'll see in some books, there's going to be a first number in front of like the verse, so to speak, or the paragraph or the section. And then there'll be one in parentheses, and that'll have a different number, which refers to the other edition. So depending on your edition, they've organized the thoughts in different ways. So I think it's kind of cool, in a way, we're just piecing together all these ideas he had for putting together his apologetic, but we really don't know what he would have finally included or how he would have rephrased it. But I love the fragments because you're able to kind of like, oh man, I see what he's thinking here. Now, maybe you don't need to use that in apologetics or whatever, but I like that idea and that helps me. And I was sharing it with you, Chad, like before the podcast, like there was something he was saying about how we're always thinking about the future or the past, but we're not thinking about the present. And, that was really helpful for me, and there's so many little nuggets in there, like, wow, I'm learning about human nature and fascinated by how he thinks and the way he illustrates certain ideas. And it gives me ideas, too, about how when we are trying to do evangelism or persuade people, that there are illustrations like the people in chains, or the people who are marching to the abyss, but they put something in front of their face so they can't see it, or they want to just forget about it. Well, those are memorable. And how we can use that sort of appeal to people and say, hey, listen, we're all going to die, but we've got an iPhone in front of our face to make us forget about the fact, And so there was a quote here about his methodology, if you want to call it this, his methodology. Men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it might be true. The cure for this is first to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence in every respect. Next, make it attractive, make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. Worthy of reverence because it really understands human nature, attractive because it promises true good. And there's that aspect there where he talks about really understands human nature. And a lot of Pascal's apologetic is saying, here's what man is really like. Now, if there's a true religion out there, it's got to really account for the greatness of man and also the folly and the fallenness and the wretchedness of man. And he really drives that home big time. And I think that's useful because we have to start where people are at and let them kind of, he's trying to wake them up, say, hey, listen, there's more to life than entertainment, that sort of a thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, when you look at that quote, he says there that the cure is to first show them that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence in every respect. And then, of course, make it attractive, make good men wish it were true. And it kind of goes back to that theme that we've come back to numerous times on the podcast of showing that Christianity is both true, but also showing that it's good.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to take too much time on the methodology aspect there, but there's a few quotes I've drawn out here about man's condition and how he a lot of times is talking about how we're just distracting ourselves. It says here, if our condition were truly happy, we should not need to divert ourselves from thinking about it. Great insight. And again, he says, being unable to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance, men have decided, in order to be happy, not to think about such things. I think that's classic. Like, well, we can't cure death. We're all wretched and ignorant, and okay, well, let's just not think about that. let's just let's buy a nice new SUV. Let's go on a really nice trip. And not to say those things are terrible, but I mean, there are endless ways, what we've mentioned, to distract ourselves or just to run to the next new thing. But have you ever just stopped and said, hey, wait a minute, how am I living my life? I'm going to die,
Yeah, what's interesting about that, too, is that when I reflect on that, I think about atheists who will claim that, this life is the only life that I have. And so I'm going to live it to the fullness. I wonder if in some cases that could kind of be a symptom of what Pascal's talking about here, right? In that he's saying that, hey, we're all going to die. And we only know so much, which is kind of our ignorance, right? So we might as well just try to be happy and try not to think about it because this is all we have.
Yeah.
Kind of a different look at it.
Another little thought here. What people want is not the easy, peaceful life that allows us to think of our unhappy condition, nor the dangers of war, nor the burdens of office, but the agitation that takes our mind off it and diverts us. When he says agitation there, he means... He talks a lot about, we just want excitement. We want the hunt, but we don't really want, we want the chase, but we don't want the rabbit at the end of the chase. Like we just want the next dopamine fix in a sense, because we're more interested in getting distracted. We want to be distracted. And I mean, hence Netflix.
Yes.
All of our life passes in this way. We seek rest by struggling against certain obstacles. And once they are overcome, rest proves intolerable because of the boredom it produces. We must get away from it and crave excitement. Here again, it is easier to bear death when no one is thinking about it than the idea of death when there is no danger.
Yeah, so this persistent idea of just trying to avoid thinking about death and distracting ourselves from really the reality that we find ourselves in.
He points a lot to our condition, and he says a lot about how we are wretched and we are miserable, and that everything we're trying to do as people is to distract us from that feeling of, and we've heard again this quote, and I don't have it written out here, but it basically said that all the troubles in the world are the result of men's not being able to sit quietly in his home, in a room by himself. He has to go out hunting, he has to go out conquering, he has to go out starting a war or doing something, because he just needs this distraction. Because people are miserable if they sit alone by themselves and start thinking about their life or their future, the death that is to come. And one thing I was thinking about is back in the day when I would do evangelism, it was a common approach to say, hey, what do you think will happen when you die? And
right.
I don't know what is the push these days, or if people have got away from that. But, it's so important to bring it back to that, when we're thinking about apologetics and how it relates to evangelism, it's easy to be like, well, seeing I'm well versed in apologetics, I'm going to focus on connecting or, with some common ground and maybe trying to convince them that God exists. Why not? Why not start with, what do you think's going to happen when you die?
And what I like about that question too is that it is religiously neutral. So in other words, you might be, I'm just worm food when I die, or I'm going to heaven, or I will experience nirvana, or I'm going to paradise. There are various ways to answer that question, but it's religiously neutral because you can answer it, in various ways. And so it's also good to start it in that way too. But obviously, in regard to the gospel, it's a great way to start that conversation. And obviously, as Pascal is saying, that whether or not men and women will be honest and communicate this or not, this is something that's on their minds more than they want to admit.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that comes to my mind here is, like, even if you're reading Pascal and you're thinking about how does this apply to apologetics or evangelism, or how we engage with the unbeliever, et cetera, a skeptic, it doesn't mean that you have to use his approach. But it does. I think it is valuable, if nothing else, to be informed that it should be conscious on your mind that, people do try to distract themselves. People don't want to think about that. They push away from that question. It's an uncomfortable question. If it's the case that people don't really want to think about death. I mean, if you think about it, everyone's parents, most likely, most people's parents are going to die when, you're not going to die before your parents usually, right? Mm-hmm. And so everybody's got to face that. Well, how am I ready for taking care of that situation when it comes up? I mean, I'm even choosing my words carefully here because it's a painful thing, and so how much more we don't even want to think about our own death. You know what I'm saying?
It's interesting. I was thinking about, you've mentioned Ray Comfort before, and regardless of what listeners think of Ray Comfort and his apologetic approach, it does, one of the central tenets of it is getting people to think about what happens when they die. And I've watched a number of his videos because the discussions are interesting. And one of the things that is almost comes out without fail is he'll say something along the lines of, what do you think happens after you die, or something like that. And he'll say, do you think about it? And I don't think I've ever heard too many people say, no, I don't think about it at all. Everybody's usually yeah, I do. Or yeah, I have thought about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's that quote again. We run heedlessly into the abyss after putting something in front of us to stop us seeing it. So I want to transition to another topic he deals with, and that's the hiddenness of God, on God's hiddenness. I kind of like Pascal's approach because he's like, here's what he says. What can be seen on earth indicates neither the total absence nor the manifest presence of divinity, but the presence of a hidden God. Everything bears this stamp. I would challenge anybody listening to really dig up that quote. It's number 449 in the numbered Pensées from the original edition. He says, what can be seen on earth indicates neither the total absence nor the manifest presence of divinity, but the presence of a hidden God. Everything bears this stamp. And I think that's really interesting. I think that the seeking aspect has to be maybe brought to the forefront of any sort of argument for the existence of God. Like, okay, here's evidence that a search is warranted. That would be my thinking on that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And what you're saying too is consistent with with what Pascal's saying, but also consistent with what you're saying is that God doesn't, so many times skeptics or people who are questioning act as if God just wants intellectual assent. And that's actually not the case. God does not just desire intellectual assent, but he desires a relationship, a commitment. And so what you're saying is completely consistent with that idea, is that there is enough evidence for those looking for it to find it, and enough to base their commitment on. Is, I think, would be one argument.
Here's a paragraph I'm going to read. If he had wished to overcome the obstinacy of the most hardened, he could have done so by revealing himself to them so plainly that they could not doubt the truth of his essence, as he will appear on the last day with such thunder and lightning and such convulsions of nature that the dead will rise up and the blindest will see him. This is not the way he wished to appear when he came in mildness, or as in the incarnation, because so many men had shown themselves unworthy of his clemency that he wished to deprive them of the good they did not desire. It was therefore not right that he should appear in a manner manifestly divine and absolutely capable of convincing all men. But neither was it right that his coming should be so hidden that he could not be recognized by those who sincerely sought him. He wished to make himself perfectly recognizable to them, thus wishing to appear openly to those who seek him with all their heart and hidden from those who shun him with all their heart. He has qualified our knowledge by giving signs which can be seen by those who seek him and not by those who do not. There's enough light for those who desire only to see, and enough darkness for those of a contrary disposition. I really like that, because it's evidenced in the Gospels and how Jesus reveals himself. He hides himself. He says to some, don't tell him who I am. And he's got a plan. He's got a timing. He knows who he's going to reveal himself to, when he's going to reveal himself to them, but he doesn't turn anyone away. Yet he does sort of keep himself at a distance from certain people. Like, how does Jesus present himself to people? How does he hide himself and reveal himself? And if he's saying that he's God, well, why would we expect God the Father to act any differently? Like, oh, he owes this revelation to you. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, I just think that there's this thing so many people are either ignoring or not admitting to, who ascribe to, like, the power of the hiddenness of God argument, that maybe this boldness that they present this argument, God is hiding himself, therefore he doesn't exist. Well, how's that going to work for you? Humility is just like the first way in. Only the penitent man will pass. You have to have humility,
Indiana. No, I was thinking too that for the skeptic that might be listening and feeling yourself resisting this, I mean, one of the things we have to think about, I think, is whether or not you like what Pascal is saying here. This idea that goes back to there's enough light for those who desire only to see and enough darkness for those who of a contrary disposition. I mean, maybe you should think of it not in the way of like, do I like that? And maybe think of it in a way of, well, could that be true? Could it be true that this is the way that God has decided to reveal himself? And then if so, if that makes sense, or if it's possible, then respond to it and like. And Jesus said that if you do the things I'm saying, you will know whether or not they're, just for me, or whether or not, I speak on God's authority.
Yeah. It's almost like God's saying, you can't start any step of the journey towards me with pride. If you start with pride saying, well, I'll believe it when I see it, prove it, and then I'll believe it. If he did, then you'd have to humble yourself. Wouldn't you? I mean, at some point, if God is real, you're going to have to humble yourself. Humility is a non-negotiable from the very get-go.
This is a conversation I've had with people who claim that the evidence, why don't we have this evidence, or why don't we have that evidence? And one of the things I'll say to them is, I'll say, well, I can't tell you why God decided to reveal himself the way he did. I don't have that, knowledge, comprehensive knowledge to know why he chose to reveal some things and not other things. I don't know that. But what I can tell you is that we need to deal with the evidence that we do have. We can't demand evidence that isn't there. You've got to deal with the evidence that we do have.
Mm-hmm. So here's another quote. As far as the choices go, you must take the trouble to seek the truth. For if you die without worshiping the true principle, you're lost. But, you say, if he had wanted me to worship him, he would have left me some signs of his will. So he did. But you pay no heed. Look for them. It is well worth it. Another quote here from 159. If we ought to give up 1 week of our life, we ought to give up 100 years. In relation to seeking God, like, well, if God's a search to see if God is really there, would that be worth a week? If you say, yeah, I'll research that for a week, because, that's a pretty big question. I better settle that. Well, Pascal's basically, in my view, he's saying, hey, if you ought to give up a week to settle this, you ought to give up your whole life or 100 years, It's that important of a question. 160, there are only three sorts of people: those who found God and serve him, those who are busy seeking him and have not found him, those who live without either seeking or finding him. The first are reasonable and happy. The last are foolish and unhappy. Those in the middle are unhappy and reasonable. Another good one here in 242, God being thus hidden. Any religion that does not say that God is hidden is not true, and any religion which does not explain why does not instruct. Ours does all of this. So I like that because it's kind of like, in apologetics, sometimes you hear people talking about, well, what's the best explanation of all the data, all the facts? And I think Pascal's just pointing out that you have to, given your worldview has to talk about why God is hidden, and explain why. The fact that he's not obvious and just like, hey, everybody, here I am.
Yeah. You know what's interesting about that too, this idea of hiddenness, is that let's look at a couple kind of classes or groups or distinctions, if you will, of people here, of thinkers, of non-believers. So you have atheists who have these atheist platforms, atheist YouTube channels. They go to atheist conferences. Then you have philosophers of religion who are atheists, but at the same time, their job is to, as objectively as they can, consider arguments and evidence and sift through it the best they can. Now, I don't pretend to know the heart of every single one of those people, but what's interesting is it's almost, to me, seems that the person with the atheist platform is almost hindering themselves in a sense, because they're coming at this from the perspective of, well, I have to present arguments to justify my atheism, instead of presenting arguments from the perspective of, well, I'm just trying to discern whether or not these arguments are true or not. There's a difference between assessing an argument and trying to figure out whether or not it's true, and assessing an argument trying to figure out why it's wrong. And again, I'm not saying that all atheists aren't objective. I mean, somebody could flip it and say, well, what about the Christian? The Christian is looking at these arguments and they're wanting them to be true. They're trying to make them true, even if they're not sure they're true. Well, yeah, if that's what they're doing, then they're in the wrong too. But it's important. Again, I think what Pascal drives us back to is that we need to approach God in the way that he has revealed himself, not in the way we think he should have, or the way that we demand he reveal himself. I think Pascal's right too, in the sense that, look, if you think this is important enough to look into for a week, well then, give it all up, and you need to be seeking God until the question is that important that you need to be sure by the time you die. Yeah.
I would still just want to point people back to, it's not a matter of finding out the answer to a proposition. It's one of those things where you have to start with humility and then say, okay, the seeking aspect is central, and the only way I'm going to know it to be true, if it is true, is that he reveal it to me. This is it's like the testing of the hypothesis in a way, where you're saying, okay, Christianity says it's true. So what are the tests? Internal tests. Not, can I poke it in full of holes and criticisms from the outside to the point of mockery and then therefore dismiss it. No, take it from its own internal test, humble yourself, submit your heart, ask yourself, am I really willing to submit my life to God? Am I going to pray and ask God to reveal himself? Am I going to repent and turn from my rebellion? Because if Christianity is true, all this atheism and activism is rebellion. So that's going to keep me from that revelation. I need to repent and renounce these things. If these are the conditions, like if he opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble, but you're proudly hanging on to your atheism, you will not ever be persuaded unless there's you're knocked off your donkey, so to speak.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the next quote that you have here from Pascal really sums up well what you're saying.
Yeah.
He says, instead of complaining that God has hidden himself, you will give thanks for revealing himself as much as he has, and you will thank him too for not revealing himself to wise men full of pride and unworthy of knowing so holy a God. And so essentially what I hear you saying is that you've got to, it's got to begin with that humility. And Pascal's talking about the humble person there who is willing to thank God for revealing himself as much as he has, and thank him for not revealing himself to men who are full of pride and unworthy of knowing so holy a God. And so it does begin with that humility and acknowledging that God is who he is.
Talking about atheism, here's a quote from Pascal. Atheism indicates strength of mind, but only up to a certain point. I would love to see what he would have elaborated on there.
When I first read that, I thought, oh, okay, he's saying that atheists only grasp, try to understand the things that they're comfortable with. But then when I thought about it more, I actually think what he's saying is that your reason only gets you so far.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to God. Atheism indicates a strength of mind, but only up to a certain point. So I see him saying that if you look at things from the atheist perspective, through reason alone, that's only going to get you to a certain point, but it's not going to get you far enough.
I like this bit from 427. Let them at least learn what this religion is, which they are attacking, before attacking it. In order really to attack the truth, they would have to protest that they had made every effort to seek it everywhere, even in what the church offers by way of instruction, but without any satisfaction. If they talked like that, they would indeed be attacking one of Christianity's claims. But I hope to show here that no reasonable person could talk like that. I even venture to say that no one has ever done so. We know well enough how people in this frame of mind behave. They think they have made great efforts to learn when they have spent a few hours reading some book of the Bible and have questioned some basic ecclesiastic about the truths of the faith. After that, they boast that they have sought without success in books and among men. But in fact, I should say to them what I have often said, such negligence is intolerable.
Yeah, that's one of the things, too, that sometimes when you listen to deconversion stories, I mean, I am not at all taking away from the painful experience that people go through in deconverting, especially with family issues and things like that. But there are some times when I listen to people and they talk about what they believed as a Christian, I don't even recognize what they're talking about as Christianity. And so it just goes to show, it makes you wonder, like, how many hours have they actually put into reading the Bible or seeking and understanding the teachings of the church, and seeking to understand the historicity of the events, whether it be, the resurrection or whatnot. And so I think that there's a lot to be said there. I also, in the beginning there too, says, in order really to attack the truth, they would have to protest that they have made every effort to seek it everywhere. And he says there before that, let them at least learn what this religion is, which they are attacking, before attacking it. That's something that's happened to me a good bit online. People will begin talking about Christianity and accusing me of believing things, and I don't even hold to those views. They don't even take the time to try to grasp what it is I claim to believe when I say I'm a Christian. And also, I think we can flip that and just be sure that we're understanding, to the best of our ability, the views that we're looking at and assessing as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think that we'll stop there with the Pascal quotes. That's all the ones that I've highlighted for talking about today, and I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Let me remind listeners, too, that they can download Pascal's Pensées on Kindle for free.
Yes, there are some free ones out there. Good stuff. We'll link to what we can find in the show notes. And so thanks, everybody, for listening and thinking through stuff with us. If you enjoyed the podcast and you haven't left a review, please do that. Many thanks, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.